If we can notice, oh gosh, I have to live in city A or city B. Do we have a child or do we not have a child? Work or life, leading or learning or performing. I mean, all these tensions that you've just noticed here. If people think of any of the challenges that they face, naming the competing demands and then reframing the question invites us into a whole different way of thinking.
Welcome to Chain of Learning, where the links of leadership and learning unite. This is your connection for actionable strategies and practices to empower you to build a people-centered learning culture, get results, and expand your impact so that you and your team can leave a lasting legacy. I'm your host and fellow learning enthusiast, Katie Anderson. Deliver short-term results or take a long-term view. Be the expert or be a coach. Focus on business outcomes or people development. Manage the core business or innovate for the future. The security of the current state or the possibilities that come with change. What's more important, technical skills or emotional social skills? How do I balance work and life? These are many of the paradoxical trade-offs that I hear every week from you and in my interactions with leaders and organizations around the world. For most of us, these competing and interwoven demands are a source of conflict. We jump to thinking there are two distinct options that we have to choose between. We deal with the uncertainty by asserting certainty. But there's a better way. To explain how we can embrace a different approach, I invited Wendy Smith to the podcast. Wendy's the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems, as well as an award-winning psychologist and professor at the Lerner College of Business and Economics at the University of Delaware. She spent her career studying paradoxes in leadership and is on a mission to help individuals and organizations turn problems into possibilities. We started off our conversation with a question. By advocating that we reframe choices from an either or to a both and mindset, is Wendy saying that we really can have it all? Let's dive in.
Yeah, Katie, no, well, it's a great way to start off and it's great to be here with you. One of the misconceptions of both and is that both and means and. We just expand with no boundaries. And that becomes problematic because what ends up happening is that people burn out and feel exhausted. Both and is a way to rethink our challenges, rethink our dilemmas, an approach to leadership that allows for more creativity, more expansion. But it's not an approach that leads us to burnout. And the more that I speak about this, the more that I am super clear it's not and.
So what's the difference between and both and?
Well, I think just let's dive into both and for a minute so that we can unpack that idea. And then we can go back to why it's not and. The place to start is for people to think about the things that they are grappling with in their world today. What are the things that we are struggling with that we want to do better in our leadership, in our teams, in our work? What are the things that we are struggling with in our lives, in our parenting, in our partnering, in our relationships? And where are the tensions coming up? And if we look at any of those tensions tend to come to us as either ors. Do we do A or B? Am I focused on work or life? Am I focused on quality or cost? Am I focused on making sure that I'm going to innovate and change and be the innovative person for tomorrow and change oriented? Or am I focused on making sure that I am performing effectively for today? Both and invites us to notice how often we frame those as either ors and realize that we are missing out on something bigger, which is that underlying those either ors are not only these competing demands, but also how they are intertwined. And if we reframe them into how can I accommodate? How can I both be a really effective employee, develop my career, and have a really robust family? What does that mean? What does that take? What does it mean to have both quality and be cost oriented? That's when we get some more creative answers.
I love that. I tend to think about it's not necessarily like a perfect balance at any one time. Someone says, how do you balance being a career professional with your own business and having two kids at home? No one day is perfectly equal, but over the course of the month or the year, I try and be balanced on how I'm showing up and making sure that I'm putting the time to where I want to be. So it's not like every moment is balanced, but it's like that totality is allowing me to have both of those spaces.
Yes, we invite us to think about both and. So the first study I ever did was at IBM, and I was looking at how they were navigating the tension between who they were for today and their existing customers and also changing for tomorrow. And some of them were really focused on what do we do today Some of them were really focused on how do we change for tomorrow. There were a few that were saying, wait, in order for us to be effective, we've got to keep doing what we do today and innovate for tomorrow. I expected that that meant that they would find all of these, what we call creative integrations, as like ideal things where their innovation would let them be more effective today, or their competencies of today would let them. We talk about that as a creative integration, this ultimate both and, as a mule. We use the metaphor of the mule because it's this bringing together of the donkey and the horse, you get the better mule. And that's not what happened. What happened at IBM was more of what you are talking about, which we call tightrope walking, or being consistently inconsistent, which is over time, I'm committed to these different things, but I'm constantly in this balancing stage like the tightrope walker.
I really like that analogy when I was reading your book, and how it's like we have to make those micro adjustments. And sometimes it's like we're almost standing on one leg more than the other, maybe not how a typewriter would do it, but it's how do we over the time create the right balance for our lives? And that's different for different people too, based on, what's right for them or in the moment.
Katie, you're bringing me back to the very first study that I ever did, which was at IBM. And that was what I did for my dissertation. And I was studying how at IBM leaders were navigating the tension between their current customers and existing products, and then changing and shifting for tomorrow. And what we found in that study, what I expected is that the teams and the leaders that were really able to hold both would creatively bring them together into what we would call this creative integration, this ultimate win-win. We use the metaphor of that of the mule, because the mule is this biological hybrid, oldest biological hybrid that we've been breeding as humans, bringing together a donkey and a horse. And they did that sometimes, but more often they were doing exactly what you're talking about, which is this dynamic shifting, which we call the tightrope walker, which is committing over time to both the today and the tomorrow, but finding these sort of nuanced, shifting, micro shifting ways of moving their resources and their allocations between the today and the tomorrow.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things I talk with a lot of leaders about, who are trying to create this culture of where everyone's a problem solver and engaged at all levels, but they themselves, as either the change leader or the operational leader, have a lot of experience and expertise. And I talk about, it's not necessarily a trade-off between, are you an expert or are you more of a coach? You can be both. And actually, it's like this continuum of leadership. It's just about knowing being intentional about what's the right way to be showing up in that moment. How is that aligned with like the outcome you want, the impact you want? And so you can actually be both, like an expert and a coach. It's just like which is the right way. I'm sort of doing a tightrope walking with my hands, so that the microbalance, so that you're showing up in the way that's going to be most effective. And it sounds like that's what you were talking about at IBM too. How do you have that long-term thinking for the innovation, but also addressing the business needs that need to happen today as well?
And here is the, extension on that. Yes. And that if you think about the question of how we show up as a leader. So am I in the moment as the expert being able to contribute? Am I overarching looking out and, being the coach and inviting others in? The key there is not just that you can shift between the two. It's then asking the next level deeper question, which is, how does being able to do both of these inform one another? How is it that your own expertise actually makes you a better coach to look up and across all of these things? How is it that taking the broader vision and bigger picture and being able to bring everybody together actually enables you to dive deep into your expertise? What's the integration between them? There's the magic of both and.
Oh, I love that. If that one step further of that, how do they make you? It's not that you're this or that in any one moment, but how do they actually complement and make you even better in both ways? So I love that.
And I think that what you're pointing to is, when we coach people, coach leaders, and they're dealing with a dilemma, we invite them into a sort of 3-step process. And you've kind of unpacked every one of them in what you just said, which is that, number one, name the dilemma and acknowledge these competing demands. So if the dilemma is, how do I lead? And am I in the weeds with my expertise? Am I looking beyond in my coaching? Like, name that, acknowledge that you are framing it as an either or. And then first step, change the question you ask. How can you accommodate both? And then pull them apart. What is valuable, unique? Under what conditions is it important to be the coach? Under what conditions is it important to be the leader? Pull them apart. We talk about it separating. And then seek and look for the points of connection. How do they reinforce one another? How can you accommodate both in service of moving into not just, am I going to make a choice between which one of these is my leadership? But how do I continually choose dynamically where I'm going to lean into? So figure out the dilemma, reframe it, pull it apart, bring it together, and then think about it as an ongoing choosing. I'm going to figure out what I need for the moment, but I'm going to be living into that shifting dynamic.
And it sounds like, too, it's pulling out the essence of what each parts are so that you can integrate that. Maybe it's not like how you envisioned it manifesting in the beginning, and that was maybe setting up that polarization of the paradoxical choice. But really, when you strip it down and reframe it in a different way, you can see that there are elements that actually can be integrated or complemented.
Yeah, and reinforcing each other for sure.
So I want to go back. So this is really helpful, this both and thinking and how we can leverage it in our lives and at work. Let's go back to what we were talking about of the and how both and differs from and.
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple weeks ago, I was keynoting at a women's conference. I think the and is a particularly pernicious problem for women who don't want to have boundaries and say no. And both and is about partially having boundaries. So, here's an example. I was talking to a leader the other day who was committed to a group of people really wanting to get stuff done, right? Committed to a project, and it was actually a project that was sort of an off the side of the desk project, and it was a great project. And in that conversation, what became really clear was that this off the side of the desk project was preventing this leader from being able to do the main demanding things that would allow her to be able to push forward on the revenue generating P&L oriented main part of her job. And ultimately what it was doing was it was killing her main job. And so the question was, okay, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, what she was trying to accomplish was to be an effective leader with her P&L, but also creating the conditions in which she was very inclusive of other people. Okay, well, how do you enable your P&L and your inclusion in a way that allows you to be able to go forward and be successful? And what she realized was that the off the side of the desk piece, while it seemed like it was inclusive and helpful, was actually killing her potential to be effective and successful going forward, and had to have some boundaries around that. Well, that's moving from both and to both and. What is the clear both and so what she ended up doing was rethinking how she showed up as a leader with her people in terms of the P&L work that she was doing and in terms of the main business line of business work that she was doing that was more inclusive, that didn't require her to do this off the side of the desk like diversity group work that she was being asked to do. That changed that shifted it. Okay, that's a both and approach rather than an and approach.
Sometimes it seems that like there are mutually exclusive choices though, like, are you going to live in city A or city B? Or I hear this is more of a personal example, but is someone like want children and their spouse doesn't want children? How do you help people approach those seemingly truly paradoxical choices?
Yeah. Yeah. So the invitation there is to start with what's the dilemma, right? So again, it's going to go back to this process of what's the dilemma. And certainly you're not going to, and one of the reasons we face dilemmas, I just want to name them, is because we have limited resources. And so often those resources are at stake. We have limited, so it's time and space. We can't live in the same city at the same time. We can't, right? And so it feels like it's an either or choice because we have to choose between these things that really, like you said, feel mutually exclusive. The invitation is to start with pulling these things apart and understanding what's at stake for each one. What is at stake for living in city A versus city B? City A might be that you're closer to family, that you are closer to geographically things that you want. City B might be more adventurous or more enabling. Okay, so then instead of asking, do I live in city A or city B? One question could be, how can I accommodate a life in which I am close to family, but at the same time have adventure? Well, that might open up all kinds of new possibilities. It's not just about where you live, but about how you engage with your life.
I really appreciate that example because it shows how the reframing of the problem you're trying to solve is so powerful. And we can think about that in so many different applications as we're jumping to like, what are the solution options rather than what's the actual problem we're trying to address. So maybe it really is, what's the lifestyle I want to be living rather than is it city A or city B? And that's a whole, that opens up in so much. And we can apply that in operational organizational work as well. So going back to what are we not seeing as the potential solutions, but how are we going back to what's the challenge we're really trying to address?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a work example that has come up pretty significantly in companies as I'm doing this work. And it's the example of hybrid work, right? We're coming back from the pandemic. Do people work from home or do they work from the office? And companies are making really bold, but like universal decisions about this without being really thoughtful. What are we trying to accomplish, right? So if we did the same process, instead of asking work from home or work from the office, where people are like, okay, 3 days here, 2 days there. Well, that's not accomplishing anything. Okay, all these people work from home, all these people work from like, what are we really trying to accomplish when it comes to work from home? We want to give people autonomy. We want to give them more flexibility. We want to accommodate people's needs so they don't burn out. What are we trying to accomplish about work from the office? We're trying to get people to be more collaborative and connected and to build relationships. Instead of just asking work from home and work from the office, how about we ask, what does it take to enable us to give people the autonomy and the flexibility and minimize burnout in our business while simultaneously ensuring connections and collaboration? And maybe that means not just come to the office, everybody, but when we all come to the office, we're really thoughtful that we're all having a all team meeting. Or maybe it's not just work from home. It's give people more flexibility on hours or give people the potential to work from home. But then we are ensuring that when they do, we know when they're available or when they're not. It's different ways of being more thoughtful about trying to accommodate or accomplish what's at stake in each of these outcomes.
And what are you seeing what's the risk when leaders aren't able to shift from this either or to this both and type of thinking?
Yeah. I mean, we talk about 3 different patterns of risk. So the first pattern is when we pick a side, we get really stuck in it, and then the world changes around us and we can't change. And we talk about that as the rabbit hole. And this is the classic problem of existing companies getting stuck in the way that they do things and not being able to make the change to the future. We see this with individuals too. We get stuck in who we are and our beliefs about ourselves and our identities. And it's really hard for us to change when the world changes around us. So that stuckness is one of the big risks. We have our second huge risk is that when we change, we overcorrect and we sort of shift to the other opposite side. This happens in companies. We're going to be so team-oriented. Everything's about teams, but then nobody's getting any work done. So then we shift. Okay, everybody's doing things on their own, and we sort of make these big moves. But the most pernicious, the most problematic that we see when we get stuck in either or thinking is when we're in relationships. When I pick a side of something and I have a choice and I pick a side and I assume that I am right, I therefore assume that anybody who picks the other side is wrong. And we get into the us, them, polarizing, fighting conflicts without doing the deep, like, let's really unpack, listen, respect, value, understand to come to a better decision. And we call that trench warfare because you could just imagine the idea that we have a point of view, we sort of dig a trench, we surround ourselves by people that agree with us. It's the us versus the them over there that we don't even know who the they are. Like if folks listening to this, just as one piece, notice and hear how often we say they, and we don't really understand what they are about, whether the they is, somebody who disagrees with us, or the they is someone in our company that like they, the finance people, they, the R&D people, without really understanding, then we're losing out on all kinds of potential creativity, and we're creating detrimental conflict where it doesn't need to be.
What you're saying resonates with a quote that I pulled out from your book that really stood out to me in the beginning about saying we have to honor the complexity of our world by understanding, appreciating, and embracing the opposing forces. And you and your co-author were talking about actual politics and how political leaders like Barack Obama and John McCain were handling these really global challenges that can get into that really that trench warfare mindset that unfortunately it seems like we are a bit stuck in across the country and across the globe here today. What are some things that you learned about how leaders like McCain and Obama approached this either or dilemma and really moved into that both and to be successful?
Yeah. We're really big fans of saying the first thing is just noticing how often we frame the problems as an either or, and we frame it as an us them. And so if I am on one side of the political spectrum, for example, and I just see or feel or sniff something that's different than me, it's them, it's they, I resist, I reject. So there's the framing question, noticing the either or and then shifting. I also want to just name there's the emotional side of this too, which is that great leaders are able to notice how emotionally triggered they might get when people reject or resist, but then don't get caught up in those triggers. We talk about it as finding comfort in the discomfort, where the discomfort is how uncomfortable the uncertainty is, how uncomfortable it is to be in a space where my truth and your truth can both be right. And that discomfort, I mean, people are experiencing this certainly in the United States, but around the world, they're experiencing that discomfort for sure when it comes to politics. How uncomfortable it is that if somebody believes something different than me, it's just triggering. And what is it like to sit in that discomfort and still recognize that you could honor and respect the person who believes something really different than you? I mean, I imagine people listening to this, I could just imagine like what if it's like if you have a strong political opinion to sit down with somebody who has a different political opinion and be open-hearted to hear what they have to say, knowing that it's uncomfortable and yet knowing that you can sit through and as we say, find comfort in the discomforts, be able to navigate that discomfort.
And coming from a place of respect and curiosity as well, and that happens at work as well. I like that concept, and it really resonates with me of the being comfortable with the discomfort. And I talk about we have to be more comfortable with this concept of struggle as well. And we often have this mindset that we need to be sort of expert leaders or have everything nailed down, and how do we get more comfortable with that discomfort of learning something new or not being perfect? And then when we can let go of that, it actually puts us in much more of that learning mindset, and that we're able to both be a leader and a learner at the same time, which seems to be one of those paradoxes that a lot of leaders that I work with feel challenged by. Like, how can I be out there sort of leading the way, but I'm also trying to do something different, and that's uncomfortable. So how do we get more comfortable with that discomfort and that sense of struggle?
Yeah, I think that this leans into part of the challenge of the leader being able to have vulnerability and the courage of vulnerability, the power, the boldness, the courageousness of vulnerability. What does it mean for the leader to say, I don't know? How can the
Yeah.
lead and what we find, and this is Brene Brown's research, and this is a little bit of Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety, that creating the conditions where the leader can say, I don't know, or help me learn, or tell me more, or I need to know more, actually opens the door for everybody else to be a learner. And by doing that, leads the way into a learning mindset, into a psychologically safe mindset. And so there we see that ironic both and the ways in which the power and boldness of uncertainty creates more the conditions in which you are going to lead other people to be learners as well, which is what you want in your organization.
Right. And how can this embracing of the both and mindset actually be what creates that growth or growth mindset that Carol Dweck talks about too, the real learning organization?
And I think you can name it, right? You can name, like, being in learning mode is about experimenting, trying, failing. Being in performance mode is about not failing. And
Right.
can you name those two poles
Mm.
and just use the language as a leader? People often ask me, well, what do you have to do as a leader to lean into both and? Well, part of it is just getting people on the same page with the language. I have leaders who the language they use is, if you're going to live, you have to breathe. And so you have to breathe in
Mm.
and breathe out. Or it's like a stop sign. You got to stop and go and rest. And so how could you use the language to say, this is a both and, like learning is different than performing. We got to do them both. We got to breathe in and breathe out. That's the role of the leader, to create the conditions for the team to be able to sit with that kind of complexity.
That's so powerful. And I talked with Eduardo Briseño about this learning zone versus performance zone on one of the
Yeah.
early episodes of this podcast. So I encourage listeners to go back and listen to that, because he talks about how we can actually do that more effectively. And as Wendy's saying here, be aware of when can we be in this learning zone and when can we be in this performing zone, and how can we label that. So again, it doesn't have to be you're always performing or you're only learning, but yeah, and both.
Yeah. And Katie, I want to say I love Eduardo and I love
Yeah.
his work. And I love the idea that we have these different tools or these different approaches. So we've got the learning zone and the performing zone. And I want to then push us to that next step in the both and. And let's name how being in the learning zone allows us to perform better. But like, let's name that relationship between them, because that's what gets us to the depth of the creativity.
Love that. And in naming it, not just for yourself, but he said, like, I say labeling it, like telling people what you're doing and why, because we often, this is a great leadership skill to have, is like we assume people know what's going on for us inside, or just can tell. But the more we put it out there and say, like, this is a situation where we can be more learning, and like almost narrating what the situation is or what we're doing, actually creates the conditions where people can understand and learn as well. And it keeps you aware and intentional about your actions.
Yeah. The greatest leaders that I've worked with are the ones that are constantly saying, hey, what's the both and? Hey, what's the, and they have to do it again and again and again.
How can listeners start bringing in this both and thinking for themselves personally? That's the first question. And then as they're trying to like build this sort of organizational muscle for both and thinking. So let's start off with the personal level. How can you start bringing in more of this framework and action?
I mean, we like to say that it's starting with noticing how questions are framed to us and changing the questions we ask. I have colleagues, my colleague Ella Marone Spector over in INSEAD in Paris, in Fontainebleau in France, has done some research where she just changed the questions that she asked of people, students in the lab. And by changing a question from noticing these things are in conflict with each other and we have to choose between them, to how can we accommodate them both, it led to all kinds of more creative outcomes. So if we can notice, oh gosh, I have to live in city A or city B. Do we have a child or do we not have a child? How to work or life, leading or learning or performing. I mean, all these tensions that you've just noticed here, if people think of any of the challenges that they face, naming the competing demands and then reframing the question invites us into a whole different way of thinking.
That's great. And so let's now take this to the organizational level. So, a lot of organizations I work with are, these are paradoxes that you talk about in your book, and some of the which you've mentioned here, like that short term, like we got to get our, the profits and the deliverables now, but we want to build this culture of continuous learning. It's actually going to it's going to take a long-term payoff, or, we want to be sustainable, or, like all these different trade-offs. How can we start to create this muscle within organizations?
Yeah. Katie, I love that. I like to say that 20 years ago when I first started teaching leadership, and I teach in a business school, and the concept of emotional intelligence was so novel. It was like, oh, wait, we have another intelligence besides just our cognitive intellectual intelligence, and we can have this social intelligence, and here's what it means. And now, 20 years later or whatever, when you talk about EQ or EI or however people label it, people are like, oh yeah, of course, we know that's important. We just need to know how to do it. I'm pretty convinced that in organizations and in leadership development in the next 20 years, we're going to move from, oh, wait, we frame our questions or our challenges, or we tend to approach life as an either or, and there's this both and underlying that is the concept of paradox and living into interdependent opposites, to, oh yeah, both and. I get it. We need that. How do we do it better? And I'm pretty convinced that is going to be a huge leadership competency that people are going to have to embrace, because our organizations are so complex. And the greatest leaders that we have out there now are saying we can't just choose between today and tomorrow, or tradition and modernization, or being global or being local, or focusing on social, focusing on the bottom line, or focusing on social and environmental. We have to figure out how to do both and how these things reinforce each other. We just have to do that.
And for my lean and continuous improvement practitioners out there who are listening, this is like, it can't just be the technical process improvement we're doing or focusing on the people. It's both. How do we do both
Yeah.
together and not
Yeah.
just be like offline? How do we integrate them,
Yeah.
do it together?
I also love your process improvement lean folks because, so much of this mindset, so much of this approach. So we like to say that this is an approach that's 2,500 years old, but we in organizations and in leadership are like late to the paradox party. We're only now starting to embed this into how we think
Mm.
about leadership in organizations. But like the early practitioners of this were like the Toyota production system. Anybody who studied TPS and Toyota production system and lean knew that it's about having every bit of having all the inventory we need and having no inventory, or being able to like always be learning but performing it, like Toyota production system really leaned into that kind of paradoxical mindset and led the way.
Yes, I mean, I spend a lot of time in Japan and with Toyota
Yeah.
leaders and their suppliers. And one of the things I think is really a great mindset they have is how they almost like set up those paradoxes of pushing themselves like, well, we're going to set a higher goal that's going to like, we don't know how to possibly do that. But this then challenges us to think both and like, how can we, opposed to where I see a lot of companies in the West, US, Europe, wherever, setting goals maybe based on what we think is possible rather than what we actually need. And so
Yeah.
it's that learning mindset of how does that stretch us?
Yeah, and that's the both and question. How can we get to that ultimate goal of bringing together these opposing ideas and
Mm.
seeing how they reinforce each other? There it is.
Yeah. Wendy, you
Yeah.
had an example at the end of the book I thought was really powerful about how Unilever was really bringing this both and mindset to an organizational level to develop this paradox system that you called it. I was hoping you could maybe share just a few of the key things that they did that
Mm.
really enabled this both and thinking to be pervasive at the organizational level.
Yeah, some of your listeners might be familiar with Paul Pullman and the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. When Paul Pullman started as the CEO of Unilever in 2008, 2009, he would say they were on a death spiral. And when he left in 2019, about 10 years later, they were one of the top packaged goods company in America. And part of his commitment was that they were going to double their bottom line, double their profits, their revenues through, not in spite of, not but through, because of a commitment to a whole set of social and environmental goals. And they had a very clear, very delineated set of what these goals were. They weren't vague at all. They were very specific of how they were going to make a difference in the world. And so he was really leaning into, at the strategic level, a commitment to navigating this, what we call the sustainability paradox or an obligation paradox, the obligation to both making their company as effective as possible and enabling the external, the social, the environmental, the communities that they are part of, multiple additional stakeholders, as effective as possible. And I'll just say there was a couple of really key pieces that he did. The first thing he did was, when we interviewed him, he said, the number one thing that I did was make sure I had a very clear, overarching, impassioned mission, vision that encompassed these competing demands. Their vision was to make sustainable living every day sustainable living. And that was both emotionally engaging and motivating, but it also was really clear that this was bringing together both the social and the financial. And the second thing he did, as he was really clear, this is going to bring up tensions. It's going to bring up challenges. Like, do we create, bottles and products that are larger size and therefore minimize the packaging, but then that minimizes our margins, or do we create smaller packaging and higher margins? And for him, he was clear that he was going to live into and surface those tensions so that they could work through that and be more creative about it.
Starting with purpose that's bigger than just profit, like going something people can really emotionally hook on, is something we've talked about a lot on this podcast. And that is the unifying, like the purpose that can actually bring us together more effectively on the tensions that come up in those paradoxes, right? Something you brought up too, it was about encouraging experimentation. And I think that's so key as well. It's like we learn our way forward to how we're going to do this. So how can we use both and thinking and then make experiments and then discover our way into that cohesive outcome that we're hoping to get.
For sure. And then constantly reevaluate and try new things, for sure. I mean, that's the experimentation mindset. As you said, we in the book, we worked to bring together about 20, 25 years of research of different strategies needed to enable both and as an overarching approach in our lives, in our businesses. And we have 4 buckets of things that are important. And one of our buckets, and it's the one that we speak about the least, and I'm so glad you said this, we call it being dynamic. And it's that ongoing, shifting, changing, learning, trying new things, processing, being open to serendipity and novelty along the way that enables us to constantly reevaluate how our competing demands are in relationship to one another.
Well, thank you. Everyone could go and read more in Wendy's fabulous book, Both and. And thank you for being here, Wendy. I look forward to having more conversations together and encourage all our listeners to connect with Wendy. I'll put more links in the show notes as well. Thank you for being here, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
One of the most valuable aha moments I had in this conversation with Wendy Smith was the realization that when we see choices as a paradox, an either or situation, we're often jumping to conclusions of what we think are two polarizing solutions, rather than understanding the real challenge or problem that we're trying to solve. It goes back to our human habit of wanting to jump to solutions and to action, and our discomfort with uncertainty by asserting certainty by creating these polarizing options. When I teach problem solving, whether it's using A3 thinking, a format for problem solving and communication developed at Toyota, or basic plan, do, study, adjust cycles, one of the biggest challenges I help leaders and process improvement experts alike to overcome is our human tendency to go to solutions or the choices we want to take for action when we really need to take time to first deeply understand what problem you're trying to solve, what your choices really are, and what do you really want to achieve. The paradoxes are limiting your thinking of what might be possible. And remember, it all goes back to understanding purpose. What's your purpose? And what's your organization's higher purpose? And how can you leverage purpose to be what unites seemingly conflicting options together? Be sure to check out Wendy's book, Both and Thinking, and follow her on LinkedIn for regular insights about how to bring together thoughts about both and how we can manage the paradoxes that appear in our life and in our work. I'll put links to connect with Wendy and her book in the episode show notes. As you reflect on this episode, go back to the 3-step process Wendy suggested for how you can deal with those dilemmas you're facing, or how you can coach the leaders you work with to think through what seems to be paradoxical choices in your organization. 1, name and acknowledge. Name the dilemma of the competing demands that you're facing and acknowledge that you're framing it as an either-or situation. Then change the question you're asking. How could you do both? So the second step is pull apart the elements of the options to help you understand what the real choices are. What are the real things you're trying to achieve? And then 3, bring them together. How could you incorporate the elements that are most important into a different solution than you originally envisioned? One that includes elements of both. And then experiment your way forward. What are you learning along the way? This goes back to how we can think about coaching for problem solving and problem solving in our organizations. How can we use both and through our whole problem solving process? If you want to go deeper into some of the concepts that Wendy and I explored here, be sure to check out some other episodes of Chain of Learning, including episode 5, in which Eduardo Briseño and I talk about how to overcome the paradox of performing or learning. And in episode 3, where Carol Dweck and I explore how developing a growth mindset is the foundation of a continuous improvement culture. In episode 32, where Isaac Mitchell shares how deeply understanding a bigger purpose, both at the organizational and the personal level, helps you navigate the challenges and crises that emerge in organizational leadership. As a change leader, executive, or continuous improvement practitioner, your success hinges on your ability to reframe choices to help bring people along on your vision for what could be possible. You can be both an expert and a coach. You can focus on business objectives and people development at the same time. You can deliver both needed short-term business results and take a long-term view that embraces innovation, sustainability, and a people-focused culture. You can be a leader and a learner. And you can help your leaders and team members build the muscles for this thinking too. Stop seeing choices as binary and start embracing both and thinking today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe now and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues so we can all strengthen our chain of learning together. Thanks for being a link in my chain of learning today. I'll see you next time. Have a great day.